So, happy Friday again, but it's Saturday. Surprise you. Bonus round. Because for the first time ever, guess who's in the studio here? Dr. David Peck from Better Bee, who's head of their research and development and education program. So, he's here to talk to the Northwest Pennsylvania Beekeepers Association. And we're doing that at Edinburgh University on Saturday morning, which has already gone by the time you're seeing this. So, I'm sorry you missed it. If you weren't there, too bad for you. But so what I did was we got too many questions for me to handle because, as some of you know, I've had a cough recently, have to start and stop. So I thought, since Dr. Peck is here, why not give him some of the overflow questions chosen completely at random? And I'm going to let him field those questions, and then we'll go on to some discussion, maybe giving the viewers some information about what new beekeepers could be looking at and what they consider setting up their first hive in the spring right here in the United States. So
Terrific.
Welcome, David.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. My mother always told me that an appropriate thing for a house guest to do is to appear on the YouTube channel of the person who's hosting them. So I figured this was only a nice way for me to pay back Fred and his wife for having me here.
Wise one.
So should we just jump into a couple of questions?
Jump right in.
All right.
Yeah.
I think I know how to do this. I sit here and then I really casually read something out and then I unload some wisdom. So this is a question that came in from Candace Dainty, and the question is, it begins, "Hi Fred," but I'm going to ignore that because she didn't know I'd be reading it. It says, "This is my first year with bees, and I'm really flying alone. I ordered my bees, 2 nukes, from a local beekeeper, but I'm not real confident. He has a commercial operation. He tells me that the nukes come from Florida, and it's up to the beekeeper to see to their survival. Oof. While I agree with that, I'm not happy with his rather cavalier attitude. I'm sort of inclined to agree with you. But it is what it is. Expectant mother that I've been many times, I anxiously anticipate their arrival soon." So that's fun. I do agree that it's hard when the person selling you bees says, here they are, good luck. If you kill them, you'll probably buy them from me next year too. So it's not an appealing attitude to find. I think that folks who are selling bees have some responsibility to make sure that those bees are going to a good home. So here's Candace's plan. She says, "I have 2 flow hives with the brood boxes ready for occupancy." Good. "I live in central Wisconsin at the same horticultural zone as you." So that's good. "I've bought slatted racks, 2 rapid round feeders for 1-to-1 sugar syrup, and some Honeybee Healthy." All right, so you're going to add that to your sugar syrup. "I've also got 2 in-hive water feeders to add salt when they need it." That's a whole sentence that we're going to have a conversation about. But I plan to use alternate open frames so my bees can build as they will. Bees go in, nuke into 1 box with no supers, and then you keep a tight ship. That's easier to protect. That's a good point. So this is an eager, expectant bee parent, and this is someone who I talk to versions of Candy all the time. So it's very common that people will go in, they'll get excited, they'll buy 30 different things that they're going to put into their hives. They're going to configure it so that the bees have 10,000 different foods and beverages and salt supplements on offer. But I think that it's important not to get too excited and then throw so much at your bees that they don't really know what's going on. So I'm not familiar with in-hive water feeders. I would probably steer you away from that. Putting water in the hive doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Adding salt, so I guess you're going to put salt water in the feeders. I'd scratch that whole plan. If your bees need salt, they'll find it. There are folks who will say that in certain climates or certain environments, it might make sense to give bees extra salt or supplemental sodium, or they might be excited about certain kinds of salts and minerals. But for the most part, if you're in central Wisconsin, it's unlikely that your bees are going to be in a terrible state because you didn't give them an in-hive water feeder full of salt, and I suspect that could cause a lot of problems if things go wrong. So for an expectant bee parent, I think your job is just to make sure you get them into good, healthy brood boxes. You allow them to start building. I do like the 1-to-1 sugar syrup plan. I think that's a good way to feed them. And you say you're planning to place the hives on a long south-facing wall with the entrances facing east. That's perfectly reasonable. If you took 10,000 beehives or 10,000 bee nests from 10,000 trees that they had naturally moved into, we do see that they have a bias towards having their entrances face south or southeast. And so typically we would recommend point it south, you're going to get more sun shining onto the porch of the hive, and they're going to have a little bit more opportunity to get warmed up in chilly mornings, but it's not critical. You can point your hive in any direction, and your bees will be perfectly happy. And good, you're planting bee-friendly flowers, and that's the right strategy too. It's not going to provide all that much nutrition for your bees if you're just planting some bee-friendly flowers in your yard, but they'll hit those first before they keep going. It's important to remember that your bees are flying kilometers away, miles away from your hive, and so even in an environment where you've got tons of flowers around you, if you mowed them all down, your bees aren't going to starve to death. They'll just fly a little further and go to the flowers there. But it's still a good practice. It's good for your bees, and it's good for native bees, who might benefit from those backyard flowers even more than your honeybees will, because they're going off to maple trees and making honey from that instead. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, before we move on,
Yeah.
a couple of things I want to ask about. First of all, there's a jar of Honeybee Healthy right there if you want to snag it.
There we go.
Now, that's what Honeybee Healthy is. It comes as an essential oil mix. It's
Drink it.
proprietary. In your opinion, what's that good for?
So the feeding stimulant claim is the claim that Honeybee Healthy makes. It's something that adds odor to the feed that you've offered to your bees. And if you've ever sniffed pure sugar water, it doesn't have much of a smell to it. Bees inside their dark hive are navigating largely by smell, and so by adding that, it seems to motivate the bees to go up to the feeder. It seems to get them more inclined to start taking down the feed faster. And so I think that's the most defensible of the claims and sort of the
And
best
then
use
would
of it.
it serve to extend the sugar syrup so that it doesn't spoil so soon?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't think it would spoil sooner. Certain essential oils can certainly have antimicrobial properties, but I don't know that I would plan on using this as my sole preservative.
Okay. The other thing is, there's a question here about slatted racks.
Oh, yeah.
Would you like to explain what those are and what the benefit might be to having that in a hive?
So a slatted rack is just an extra piece of wood. It's essentially a shim. Do you have one kicking around back here?
I'm looking for it.
Ill-equipped if you don't. A slatted rack is essentially just going to be a wooden shim that's got bars underneath it that are in the same configuration as the top bars of your frames, and you would typically put that down at the at the entrance. So if we set this up here, that's what it's going to look like. You're going to have your bees flying in and then moving underneath this and upwards to the surfaces of the frames that are in the boxes above. And so there are a couple of advantages that people will sometimes claim for these. A major one is that if you've got your hive set up without a slatted rack, if you've just got your brood box right on your bottom board, you will very likely see that the very bottom inch or 2 inches of your frames are not going to have very much brood on them. The queen won't go down there and lay. They can't really, regulate the climate or the temperature or the humidity in that very bottommost strip of comb. And so the bottoms of that bottom box's frames will sometimes not be terribly well used. By elevating them, by putting in the slatted rack, now the bottoms of those bottom frames are still a few inches away from the entrance. And so you're more likely to see the queen laying right down to the bottoms of the frames. I've also seen these be put in by folks who want to give their bees just a few opportunities to make drones. If they're going to have, natural requeening or swarms, and they want to have a few drones in the hive, but all of their comb is worker-sized cells, then you can give this to the bees, and they will very often build this burr comb down at the bottom, which will typically be drone-sized cells. And so now they can raise some drones down in that slightly chillier environment, which the drones seem to fare okay in. And now your colony's made a handful of drones.
Nice. And that's right. The comb that's under here was drawn up by the bees, and it is drone size, so exactly as described here. And one of the reasons that we show this too, for those using slatted racks, some of you are using oxalic acid vaporization, and you're putting the pan under. Always do a check to make sure that your pan's not coming in contact with beeswax. So, good job.
All right. Well, that was only a half hour to get through one of them, right? Okay, so the next one is someone who would like to start using, who is this? It's
Brad
Oliphant. Brad would like to start using oxalic acid dribble in November for mites. He's watched several videos, but he's still confused about the ratios and how effective this is. So he says, can you please share the mixture ratio for a single hive? It would be really helpful. Oh, you ordered a kit from Better Bee. Thank you. And do I really, oh, okay, P.S. Do I really need a scale? Can I use teaspoons? So I'll start with the PS first, which is to say you really will get a better result if you're using a scale, because the compression of the oxalic acid crystals that you're measuring out could be very different. So the volume that you've scooped out with your teaspoon might vary from batch to batch or based on your storage conditions. So I would encourage you to really, get a kitchen scale and dedicate it to this purpose, or any cheap scale can be easily had, and I recommend it. For the measurements for what you need to actually be mixing up, I have some good news and some bad news. So the good news is I'm going to give you a formula to mix it up. The bad news is I'm not going to give you a formula for one hive. And the reason is the tiny amount of oxalic acid that you would need to measure out, the tiny number of grams, just to make enough syrup to treat one hive is so small that you're probably going to make mistakes. So this is generally a piece of advice that's given to junior chemists of any stripe. If you need to make a very, very small amount of a mixture that has a very, very, very tiny amount of some active ingredient in it, make a whole bunch and throw away the extra. Because you're going to make better measurements if you make a moderate amount of the substance, do whatever you need to do with it, and then just pitch whatever's not ready. So the recommendations that we make at Better Bee are that you never mix for fewer than 5 hives. And the 5 hive formula is 8.75 grams of oxalic acid crystals. You should use apibioxyl, which is the labeled pesticide for use in honeybee hives. And then 150 grams of water and 150 grams of just granulated table sugar. So that's 8.75 grams of oxalic acid and then 150 grams each of water and sugar. You could measure those out. The 150 grams is going to come to about 0.75 cups of both water and sugar. But if you've already got the scale out for the oxalic acid, why not be more precise? And so that's my recommendation. For one hive, mix it up for 5, treat the one hive, and then throw away the remaining treatments, because you're going to get a better result that way.
Mm-hmm. So I do have a question about this.
Yeah.
He wants to do it in November. Are there temperature concerns when you're using the dribble method?
So I've seen plenty of successful beekeepers use the dribble method in cold winters, in frozen winters. The amount of oxalic acid that you're dribbling onto a colony in cold weather is so small that they can typically slurp that up and move it off their bodies, and they're not going to get saturated and chilled. I wouldn't plan to do an oxalic acid dribble when my colony was in, minus 20 degree weather. I would generally hope that I could find a day where it might be in the high 40s and the 50s, where if I've got a cluster of bees, they're at least going to be in that sort of broader, expanded cluster where they're moving around and a little more dispersed. It would be better to do it when you had the colony freely moving. So if you had a 65 degree day where they're all out doing cleansing flights, that's a great time to go and do your oxalic acid dribble. The other thing is, we should point out, so you said, or I think you asked, whether this is an effective treatment or a good treatment. There's one thing that I should point out, which is that we do know that oxalic acid dribbling is an effective way to kill a large number of varroa mites in a colony that has little to no brood inside of it. However, the oxalic acid dribble, as opposed to the vaporization method, is going to cause some decline in the survivorship of your bees. The lifespan of the bees can be reduced because they're consuming small amounts of that oxalic acid as they're moving that syrup around. It's not going to kill your colony, or at least it's very unlikely to. It's probably not going to kill those bees, but you might have slightly fewer bees that make it all the way to foraging on crocus pollen in the spring. So it's important to keep in mind that there are some costs to doing these, and that typically what's recommended is not to do more than one oxalic acid dribble per year per season on your hives, because that's going to give them this slight hit to the bees' health, a major hit to the health of the varroa mites, and then the colony will be able to recover and weather that slight stress that you've applied.
And for those that are wondering why Brad is even talking about drizzle or dribble instead of the oxalic acid vaporization, he's concerned about the health potential of being exposed to oxalic acid vapor. So this is a much safer delivery method if you're going to treat with oxalic.
Slightly less safe for the bees, considerably safer for the human.
Right, for the humans. So those who have concerns and don't want to wear a respirator and things like that, this is an alternative. Okay, thank you.
Okay, one more. We've got a question from Labib Yan. Forgive me if I've mispronounced it. But you say, I have one colony that's in one big Langstroth box. All the frames are full of bees. Above that box, there's a queen excluder and a full-size super, which is a flow hive super. Okay. So we've got one deep Langstroth and then a queen excluder and a flow super. Nectar flow has started at least 2 weeks ago. Cherry trees were blossoming. How beautiful. In my last inspection, I found queen cells. Uh-oh, trouble a-brewing. Swarm cells with eggs inside. Okay, so they've started producing or beginning that process of producing new queens. I destroyed them and then closed the hive. 2 days after that, I inspected them again and found queen cells just like before. Sure. So they're determined to swarm. I destroyed the cells again and I removed 3 frames, 2 frames of bees, and gave them to a weak colony, and 1 frame full of resources and then stored that somewhere else. Okay. I probably would store that with that weak colony as well. And of course, I replaced the 3 frames with 2 drawn comb frames and a frame of foundation. So that's terrific. In addition, I've added another flow hive super to this colony just to test if the space is the problem or there's something else. All right, so now the colony has 1 brood box and 2 supers. The dilemma is this. I'm planning to inspect them in the next 2 days. If I find queen cells, what shall I do? Keeping in mind that if I don't want to split them, this will weaken, or that this person does not want to split them because it will weaken the hive and they won't be able to collect any more honey if I do that. So I'll start at the end and work backwards, I guess. So it's true that if you split a colony, you're going to have less honey. It doesn't mean that they won't make any. It doesn't necessarily mean that you won't be able to harvest. And that depends on the way you split a hive. If I've got 1 big hive and I split them evenly in 2, I might be able to get a little bit of honey out of both of them. I might be able to get no honey out of either by the end of the season. If I have a big colony and I just pull a little nuke out, I pull a little split out of that colony, but I leave the majority of the large hive intact, they're probably going to be a great honey producer for me that year. I've just tamped down on some of that spring growth to suppress that swarming impulse, and then they're going to continue to grow through the summer and make plenty of honey. But if you don't want to split, that's perfectly fine. Your question really is, why are these bees trying to swarm, and what do I do to stop them? And so you've fallen into that classic, sort of first attempt of many beekeepers when you find queen cells or swarm cells, is to just rip them out and hope that that solved the problem. And it's never going to solve the problem, because having queen cells is not what causes your colony to swarm. There are cues that your bees are reading from their home around them, from their environment, from the density of bees that they're surrounded by. That's what's triggering them to make those new queens, which is a part of the swarming process. So by taking away those swarm cells, all you're doing is inconveniencing the bees and challenging yourself to go through every single frame every single time and never ever miss a swarm cell. Because if you do, there goes the swarm. And so I would say that your best strategy here is to take a step backwards and think, what makes honeybee colonies swarm and how can I influence them? How can I take away some of those cues? Honeybees swarm when their brood nest is constricted or too densely populated with brood bees resources so that they don't feel like there's any room for them to expand. If a honeybee colony gets through the winter and they're in the spring and they feel like there's nowhere to grow inside their nest, inside their box or their tree cavity or wherever they are, they're going to swarm. They say, well, we can't grow here, let's split, get smaller, and then we can continue our growth elsewhere. And so the strategy that you want to adopt is to make sure your bees never feel cramped. And one of the best ways to do that is to always make sure that you have empty comb above the brood nest. Because the queen and the rest of the bees will sort of naturally grow upwards, and if they have empty comb directly above the brood nest, they will always still have that cue that there's more room in which to expand. The other advantage of that is one of the most disastrous things that can happen to someone who's trying to prevent swarming is for the colony to become honey-bound. So you've described a relatively small colony. You've got one deep Langstroth and then two flow supers on top of them. And originally they only had one. And so that's a pretty small space, and it's very easy for a colony to grow and fill that. If you have empty comb above the brood nest, then the bees are going to naturally store their nectar that they're bringing in up into that comb. If you've got a tower of comb, then they've got to fill a whole lot starting at the top and working downwards before it starts encroaching on the brood nest. And so if you make sure that you've always got extra space above the brood, you're never going to run that risk of becoming honey-bound. Having nectar or even honey inside the brood cells taking up space that the queen can no longer lay eggs. Because when that starts to happen, it's an excellent trigger for swarming. So I think that your initial attempt to rip out the swarm cells maybe just delayed them, but your strategy of putting on the new super could very well have solved your problem. And I think when you go out and inspect, you just need to see whether you've convinced those bees that they have room to grow. If not, I would probably give them more space. There are a number of different strategies that you can use to fight swarming. You can checkerboard the frames. You can open the sides of the brood nest by putting in frames where you ask them to build either on foundation or even sort of free build comb on the sides of a couple of brood frames. But all of that is probably more complicated than just putting empty comb above the brood nest and seeing if that turns off that switch in them that says, we have no more space to expand, our only choice to grow is to swarm.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting too. When we have two honey supers above the brood nest, and if that immediate honey super directly over the brood nest is almost full,
right?
Does it help to super it above that, or should they actually lift the full one and put the space directly over the brood?
A lot of beekeeping is sacrificing your own back health in order to keep your bees better. Yeah. And so in that case, I would suggest, especially when we're running a risk of swarming, under-supering, putting in that new super underneath. And checkerboarding, which is something that people hear about or talk about, but often don't fully understand the implications of, is very straightforward. All checkerboarding is I've got a full super and I've got an empty super that I'm adding to this colony. If I checkerboard, I'm just going to alternate honey, non-honey, honey, non-honey frames in that first super, and then I'll stagger it, so then I go non-honey, honey, non-honey, honey in the super underneath. And I'm basically moving those frames up and down so that my bees feel like these boxes are all partially full of honey, but they also feel like there's a whole bunch of empty comb in there. And that can trigger, or I guess trick the bees into interpreting their nest as not nearly full enough, but they'll move into all of those supers because you've got some honey frames there that they need to tend to and check on and patrol. And so you're going to wind up with sometimes better results by doing that checkerboarding instead of putting the empty one on top or even putting the empty one directly underneath the full super.
Yeah, and as Dr. Peck said, you can do all the right things. You can organize it, give them the space. Some of you like to expand your entrances to give more ventilation and things like that, and still have them swarm. So the formula, remember, you're fighting their biology and they want to reproduce, and spring is the time of reproduction. So
teaching a honeybee colony not to swarm or asking them not to swarm is sort of like asking teenagers not to sneak off in the woods and canoodle with each other.
What is that about? What?
It's important to remember as a beekeeper, especially new beekeepers will sometimes call it crestfallen, or they'll call in tears and say, "I'm so disappointed. I thought I was doing everything right. I was trying to take care of my bees, but the swarm left." And those are people who you need to sort of take by the shoulders and say, "Look, it's okay. You did everything right. You gave your bees everything they could ever have dreamed of. They had space, they had health, they were insulated, they were well fed, they were well taken care of. You gave them everything they wanted because what they wanted was to be so healthy that they could take that risk and reproduce and send off the old queen and make a new queen and turn one colony into two. So you did everything right as a beekeeper except that one thing called swarm suppression. And as long as you get that new, trick into your tool belt, you basically can tell yourself that you're taking good care of the bees. You just need to add one more thing before you are taking care of them and keeping them long enough to make lots of honey for you.
Okay, so that's it for the questions. So now we're just going to have a discussion. And so based on what people have been writing in with over the past week, we have a bunch of viewers that are receiving packages for the first time. They're picking up their nukes. they've set up hives, they're ready to go. And maybe we just go over kind of what they should expect and some of the things that catch them off guard that isn't always clear. Your package shows up early. It's cold, it's snowy, we have weird weather this year. What should they be doing with their packages to hold them rather than install in foul weather?
Well, I'll start maybe with my first piece of advice, which is that sometimes the best strategy is to install in foul weather. You, like some of these other things we've been talking about, you, the beekeeper, might be a little bit chilly, but the bees are already in a cluster. And so a package is just a simulated swarm of bees. And a swarm of bees can survive chilly weather. They're just sitting there eating food and buzzing their wings and staying warm and keeping the queen protected. So if you as a beekeeper go in and open that package and install them on a cold day, your fingers might get cold, but they'll very quickly reform around the queen and then keep themselves warm. So you have pretty decent bee survival installing in rainy weather or cold weather. The problem is you have given a whole bunch of bees a new home, and you've given them the job of occupying it and filling it, building comb in it, bringing resources in, but they don't have any resources available. So if you take your bees in and you install them on, in crummy weather, and it's going to be crummy weather for the next week, which is what some folks have been experiencing, weather where the bees can't safely fly, you've got to make sure that they're being well fed. And so I would suggest feeding a package of bees as soon as you install them if you know that they aren't going to be able to freely forage on plentiful foodstuffs in their environment.
And the preferred feed?
1-to-1 sugar syrup. There's a million different formulas that beekeepers will tell you about this and that and the other thing. Realistically, for myself, I only ever use 2 recipes, 1-to-1 and 2-to-1. Thick syrup in the fall because I want my bees to bring it in, store it, dehydrate it a little bit, and then basically keep it like honey, or 1-to-1 syrup in the spring or the summer or any time that I just need to feed them and trigger some amount of growth. It gives them moisture and it gives them calories.
That's great. And what about entrance feeders? I don't see a lot of that anymore. Are there drawbacks? I don't personally use entrance feeders. If I feed, it's inside the hive on an inner cover. What are the drawbacks or benefits, if any, of having an entrance
feeder?
So
entrance feeders are very inexpensive to make, and so they're very easy to throw into a beginner beekeeping kit. The issue is, in some climates, in warm climates, entrance feeders are generally pretty good. You get your package, you install them, you stick this entrance feeder in, and you're looking at that jar of syrup. As the level goes down, you know to unscrew it, pour some more in, and screw it back in. So it works perfectly fine if you've got nice warm weather. In a cold climate, or even a colder climate, a more temperate climate, when you use that entrance feeder, what you've basically said to your bees is, it's too cold for you to safely fly for at least part of every day. And so now I'm going to give you this sugar feeder for you to go and visit. But that sugar feeder is hanging outside of the hive. So if you've got cold evenings, if you've got cold mornings, if you've got very, very cold nights, that sugar is just sitting there losing heat and being cold. And in the morning when the bees come out and the rest of the weather has warmed up a bit, you've still got some very cold fluid that needs to get very, very warm before the bees are willing to go and interact with it. So when I recommend that Boardman style feeder, that entrance feeder, what I would typically recommend is that you actually put it inside the hive on top of the inner cover with a box and an outer cover protecting it.
Oh, there is
and so they'll
new
move up
feeder.
into there, take it down, and then it's being heated by the cluster underneath.
Or what about a jar with holes just like that?
Or a jar with holes just like that is a perfectly reasonable way.
It's amazing that this just happened to be here right next to the camera with the little holes, inverted jar feeder.
Right.
But what is your personal favorite feeder in the hive?
Honestly, my personal favorite is the frame feeder or the division board.
The frame feeder. So you give up a frame,
yeah,
put that in,
or even give up 2, depending upon the margins and the space that you've got. If you've got a propolis heavy hive,
now that requires you to take off the cover, the inner cover, so you can access that to fill it.
Correct.
And why is that your favorite?
What I like about the frame feeder is that wherever the bees are, wherever the cluster is, wherever the brood nest is, I can put that feeder right next to them. So I can put put this right into my hive, right next to the frames of interest to me, the frames of interest to my bees. If I'm going in to inspect them, or if I'm going in to refill the feeder, I really would like to inspect anyway. So I'm opening my hives when I'm refilling my feeders, because I want to know
so you
whether
tie it
the
in with a
feed's
quick
working.
look-see. Okay.
Exactly, and it's not all that hard. All I've got to do is take off any boxes or covers covering this, dump in the feed, and then I can peer down at the bees and then seal everything up again. So they're not getting very chilled. There's not terrible weather that's blowing onto them. And it allows them to keep this at the exact same temperature as the rest of the hive. That feed goes in cold, but it is eventually going to be just as warm as the bees that are next to it.
Now, are you positioning those in the number 1 and number 10 slot, or what's the best place to locate them?
Well, it depends. If I'm just feeding a colony that I think might need a little bit of a supplement, I'll typically only put it in the number 1 position.
Okay.
If I'm trying to feed an overwintered nuke that I really need to get food in, so that's going to be a 4/4 deep frame position, I might put 2 of them in the top of the hive, or I might put 1 in the sidewall position, in the bottom, and then 1 in the sidewall position in the top. So you can use it wherever you want it to be.
Okay, and what's the capacity of a deep frame feeder?
Well, I don't. This
Generally, I mean,
this
we
isn't
don't,
the
not this
brand
one particular
that I know.
Well, this
but-
isn't the brand. You know what this is for? The Layens hive.
Right.
The other thing is, so what's the capacity? Let's say Better Bee carried frame feeders. What would be the capacity of your Better Bee frame feeders?
Wouldn't it be helpful
Let's test
if I
your
knew
inventory
that?
knowledge.
What
right
I
now.
know is that I just poured 5 pounds of syrup into. No, I poured 2.5 pounds of syrup. Is that? No, I made 10 pounds. So I poured 5 pounds of syrup into a deep frame feeder, and it filled it maybe a third to a halfway.
Okay.
So I would say you could hold 10 pounds of syrup.
Okay. And now with this particular feeder, it has a lot of open surface area here. Is it important to have something over the top, both to limit the surface area exposure for the bees as far as moisture, and then also to keep them from drowning?
I don't think the moisture is probably going to be very impactful, but certainly drowning is a concern with this style of feeder. And there are inevitably going to be some bees that misstep, make a mistake, fall in, and don't get out.
Right.
And so you have to accept that there might be some casualties. But they're often not terribly dramatic. They're not catastrophic, as long as you don't have a frame feeder that's full of bees, and then you dump your gallons of syrup right on top of their heads.
Right. Okay.
But what we often will do, there's a sort of the one that we carry at Better Bee, there's a plastic lattice that you can insert down into it that basically forms a little ladder for the bees. You can also, throw that away and then just put in a wooden stick and use that as a float, and the bees will ride that down the syrup level as it goes down, and then they can ride it back up as you add new syrup.
Now with a wooden stick, because it has open pores in it,
Yes.
do we have to bleach that periodically, or what should you do maintenance-wise?
I would recommend sanitizing it if you plan to use that and reuse the same stick. But I would say that you could probably get through the entirety of a season before you needed to do that. But probably if you've pulled the feeders out and you've got them in your garage, why not go ahead and sanitize them in the interim before the feeding season starts up again?
Okay. So another thing is, some people I know that Better Bee is selling packages, and they're selling nucleus colonies now, pickup only. There are no shipping. One of the reasons Dr. Peck said they're not shipping packages is because often the packages go through some stressors and they don't arrive in great condition. But maybe we should explain to some people who haven't yet purchased bees. I know for a lot of people it's too late. All your orders pretty much had to be in by now. But if you're considering nucleus colonies, because a lot of sideliners are going to be selling nucleus colonies of bees, what are the benefits to each? The package of bees, generally about 3 pounds of bees and a queen, and then the nucleus colony. For the new beekeepers, what are the advantages?
Both of them, both of the colonies that you can start from a nuke or a package are great. They can both grow very well, and if you set up a competition between a group of packages and a group of nukes, you can often get them to basically the same spot by the end of their first summer. The nukes will tend to grow a little bit faster, and that's partially because what a nucleus colony contains, it's the nucleus, the core of an entire beehive. It's got bees, it's got a queen, they've got brood, they've got pollen, they've got honey. They've got everything that they need all there. And they've got drawn comb, most importantly. They've got typically a 5-frame nuke is going to have 5 frames of fully drawn wax comb. So the queen, on the very day that you set that into your hive, she's already used to the bees. She's moving around freely. She's laying eggs, and she'll just continue laying eggs. You're giving them more space to grow into in your hive, but they've got the core of what they need. A package, as I said, is a simulated swarm. It's not a little colony, or it's not a little hive. It's a colony that is in that sort of temporary swarming, fill up our honey stomachs and wait for a house to appear mode. And so by pouring the bees out of your package and installing them into your frames, If you're installing a package into already drawn comb, then they can get started right away as soon as the queen is released from her cage. And some folks will even open that in direct release, although I don't recommend that for beginners. But once the queen eats through the candy and is released from that cage, she can begin laying eggs on that comb. If you're installing a package on foundation, if you're installing them on undrawn comb, then obviously you're going to have to wait until those cells are built, or at least about a third of the cell is built before the queen can maneuver her abdomen over and start laying eggs in it. So it takes a little bit of time, and you have to feed those bees more. You should feed new bees that you're asking to build comb. It takes about 8 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of beeswax. So if I put a nuke into a bunch of foundation, I should be feeding them because they need to draw out all that comb. If I put a package into nothing but foundation, I need to be feeding them even more diligently because they simply cannot grow without a lot of calories coming in. And if I ask them to go forage for that, that's going to be sort of a tenuous existence for the package. But if I give them a little bit of sugar water early in the season, very quickly they can build out their comb and they're ready to start storing natural sugars in those afterwards.
So another thing, and this references the first question that was submitted here. The person that sold the package to Candace Dainty here wasn't really interested in providing any guidance, and it's basically, here's your package, you bought it, good luck, it's up to you to keep your package alive. This takes us into another area. When somebody is looking, and a lot of new beekeepers have this problem. I want to buy a nucleus colony from somebody, or I want to buy a package, but how do I know that the person I'm getting them from is reputable, and what should I be looking for? Often people have received, because I get these messages from you, the viewers, and you'll say, like, you got a package of bees and they came fully loaded with mites and small hive beetles and everything else. So how can we go about choosing, if you're a brand new beekeeper, your source for your bees?
I think that, like most of the advice I'd give to a brand new beekeeper, I'm going to say talk to more experienced beekeepers. Talk to somebody in your club, talk to somebody who you can find nearby, reach out to any kind of a local beekeeping community and say, hey, where did you get your bees? Drive down the road, see if somebody's got hives, knock on the door and say, hey, do you have any recommendations for a good source of bees? Because I have met folks, I've talked to folks who have said, to me over dinner, I love beginners who buy packages or buy nukes from me because I can sell them my worst bees, I can sell them diseased bees, they're all going to die, the people won't take care of them because they don't know what they're doing, and they're going to come right back and buy more from me next year. And so that people like that do exist within the beekeeping world. I think for the most part, folks who are selling nukes and folks who are selling packages are trying to do the best they can. They're trying to be scrupulous. If you're buying from a very large nuke producer or a very large package producer, things might fall through the cracks. You might get a package or a nuke that's not the strongest in the world, but for the most part, they're going to stand behind them and they're going to say, sorry, sometimes we mess up a little. If you buy a package or a nuke from us at Better Bee and you go home and say, hey, well, I've got a bum queen in here. We've got queens sitting on a cart in our office and we will mail one right out to you to make that right. So we recognize that there's some possibility for error in a big production.
Well, it's good that you mentioned that, because if something does happen to your queen, or if your queen fertility is low, if the production rate is not what you expect it to be, spotty brood and things like that,
or only laying drones because she wasn't really mated properly,
which are all possible. I think your queens are like $35.
Right.
Is that right?
Right.
So another thing is, depending on where you're buying your queens, you have to consider what that queen is going to go through between the supplier and the recipient. So if we're midsummer, because this happens late June and things like that, or get into July, you suddenly need a queen, you have to consider what the weather conditions are going to be. Hot weather can impact fertility of a queen.
Right.
So try to find a local source that's reputable. Right. But I was impressed because I looked that up. I pay twice that. So. And so what lines of queens, where do your queens come from there at Better Bee?
So we've got a couple. We carry Cutic queens, which are produced by Chuck Cutic and his beekeeping operation, who's a New York beekeeper, but the queens are actually produced in the same place the nukes are in the South. And so the nukes that we sell, the spring nukes, are produced by Cutics. because we've got a good relationship with them, and the queens are as well. And they're all derived from basically his production colonies. He's a honey producer first, and then this is an add-on to his business. And so those honey production queens perform well in New York and then in his honey yards. You know, they're pleasant to work with. He's happy with those queens. Those are the ones that get selected to be the sources for all of the queen grafting and queen breeding that take place in the rest of the operation. So they're not Italians. They're not, you know,
So they're kind of
Guardiolans. They're mutts.
hybrids. Yeah.
They're mutts that a beekeeper has been using and sort of maintaining and curating and cultivating. So they're not all going to be yellow and they're not all going to be black, but they're going to be good performing queens that make honey and have high fertility. And they also select for mite resistance. They do a hygienic test.
Okay, that was going to be
as
my
well.
next question. Are there any survivor stock and things like that?
Better Bee also carries some other folks provide us with Carniolan queens. I think we got those from Straycan, and I think we have Italian queens, and I'm not actually sure where those come from. The pure Italians.
So then, when they order a queen from Better Bee, are you brokering them? In other words, are they actually coming from those breeders, or do they come to you? And
they come to us. We inspect them. We take care of them. We bank them.
So you're their queen bank.
I'm the one putting the attendance in that cage before they come to you.
Okay.
But the one line that we actually do produce directly ourselves are what we call the Northern Queens.
Okay.
And those are queens taken from some of the best producers in our operation or some of the queen breeders that we work with locally. One of them is a previous owner of Better Bee, Jack Rath. And so he is out at his house in Vermont working on these queens, grafting queens, instrumentally inseminating queens and tracking their lines. And so those are bees that are selected for good survival in a cold climate like we've got in upstate New York or in New England. That are very gentle bees to work with, that produce good honey, and that also have whatever mite resistance we can select for. And so one of the things I'm most excited about having joined the team at Better Bee with my background in Varroa resistance behaviors of bees is that I'm hoping that over the course of the next few years we can take what's already a good queen breeding program and really try to dive in much more deeply to these different Varroa resistance traits and try to produce, I don't claim that I have a Varroa resistant queen. I don't particularly trust anyone who tells me that they've got a Varroa proof queen. What I appreciate is someone who says, I've tried to make bees that have their mite levels lower than the other bees nearby for longer throughout the season. I want to produce bees that have some mite resistance, so they might need a little less mite treatment. And I think that's the way that we gradually shape our stock to wind up with, hopefully, eventually, a mite-proof bee. But we're just not there yet. I haven't seen any really credible claims for bees that absolutely under no circumstances will have enough mites that they need to be treated. I think that typically any bee colony is going to need to be managed for its mites, and that none of the genetic lineages that have been maintained are where we hope to be eventually.
Work to be done.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, that was a good answer. So the other thing, a lot of people, when you've lost your queen, you're going to buy a queen, you have options. Do you want it marked? Do you want the wings clipped? What are the advantages? The marking is pretty obvious. This year we're marking them with yellow. But as far as the wing clipping, this becomes kind of a polarizing thing. Some people say that's mutilating the bee, and others say it's a more definitive way of identifying that, number one, that's your queen, and that if she does fly, if you're in an urban area, for example, and you can't have your bees swarming out into the neighborhood or in the local preschool and things like that, is there an advantage to choosing the clipped wing?
So you don't need to mark your bee and mark your queen and clip her wing, because if she's yellow or blue or whatever her color is, and you go back in the next week and you've got a blue queen, you're not going to be wondering, is this the queen that was originally in here? Her daughters don't have blue spots on their backs. Right. So, the marking is sufficient. The clipping can potentially reduce the opportunity of that queen to swarm away. Realistically, though, bees will identify a queen with clipped wings and will sometimes reject them. They'll say, oh, this queen is mutilated. We should destroy her and supersede her and replace her with a healthier queen. And I've seen that happen in bees, queens that have been
Do you have any idea
modified.
how often that happens? Because there are a lot of
there are plenty of folks who
University of Guelph, for example, they clip all their queens.
Yeah. So it's not like it's happening inevitably, but it's something that can happen. And I think that tends to be more common if soon after the clipping, because they've got that open wound. If they're put in there, sometimes the bees will interpret that as a queen in trouble and will start trying to replace her. But in my experience, a colony that decides to swarm with a queen that can't fly is just a colony who's going to, you know, swarm and then wind up without a queen. And they might return. I've watched colonies with caged queens try to swarm, come back, try to swarm, come back, try to swarm. I've watched them do it 9 times. And eventually all productivity of the colony falls apart.
Interesting you say that. They just behaved like a fire drill. Because if the queen is caged and they swarm, so they mass out in front of it, and they're all facing the hive. When's she coming out? When's she coming out? And then they all go back in. Then they all come back. When's she coming out? When's she coming out? So this is a fire drill when they're actually waiting for the queen, but she doesn't come out that day. Now here's an example where why was that queen caged? Is it so you could evaluate that behavior?
That was an experiment.
That's interesting. Yeah. Could you tell us more about that experiment?
Well, it wasn't an experiment I was doing. It was a colleague of mine. So I don't know the particular question that was happening there, but he called me over and said, "Hey, did you watch that swarm take off? Look, they're going back in. Yeah. And now look, they're taking off. And now look, they're coming back in." Because they couldn't get that. Another thing that people will sometimes do to suppress swarming, and so we have that swarm suppression question that I always like to warn people against, is they think, well, wait, I've got this queen excluder, and the queen can't get through that. And I've got this other queen excluder, and the queen can't get through that.
Yeah.
So if I just sandwich that on either side of my brood box, my bees can't swarm because the queen can't leave. And the reality is, when they start to swarm, first of all, they're trying to get the queen through. And so I've seen queens get their legs or wings ripped off by bees that were over-eagerly trying to squeeze them out through there. Even if that doesn't happen, they've already started the queen production process. And so when those new queen cells start to emerge and hatch, they're going to fight each other to the death. But they'll also fight their mother queen to the death if she hasn't left. And so now you've created this sort of cage match for all of these queens to fight it out, and you're still going to wind up with just one queen. So it's not the solution that it might initially appear to be, and I discourage folks from trying to capture a queen with queen excluders.
Is that cage right there?
This guy?
Yep. Okay. I hate to bring this up. This is for isolating your queen on a deep frame, so you can create an artificial brood break. Now, why am I frustrated? You can hear it in my voice. Better Bee I bought a bunch of these from Blue Sky Bee Supply. I bought them out. That's why you can't buy them there right now, because I took them all. But then out of the blue, whoever's in charge of merchandising and research and development at Better Bee came out with a better version of the queen cage. Can you explain how these are used and what's different about the one that Better Bee is now about to sell, right?
Sure.
When's it available?
So we've already started selling them. They're on the market, and our first batch of them has already sold out. And so now they're in production making the next batch, but they're available for pre-sale as well. So the first batch are going to be arriving, we think, in June, and then the second batch are going to be available for us to ship out in hopefully July. We're trying to move as quickly as we can. So the difference between the two is that our cage is a cage. It's not some caging that you have to sort of press into the right position.
This has to go up against the side of the box.
Exactly.
So now we can move her in the middle of the brood, for example.
Right. So what this is just two sides made out of queen excluder material and then metal all around it with a lid on top. So I can put a frame down inside, and then I can put that wherever I want it in the colony. I can use that to cage the queen onto a frame. I can also use it to cage the queen away from a frame.
Okay.
Right. So if I have a frame that I don't want her to lay on, I can have that. If I want a frame that I want her to lay on, I just have to put her in the cage as well. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with it, and it's a tool that is not meant for one particular purpose. It's something that if you're a queen breeder is very appealing to you because you want to be able to put that queen in, know that all of the eggs that she laid on this day are going to be ready for you to graft on that day. So you can go in and very quickly, scoop those out and put them where they need to be, and you'll know that they're just the age that you're aiming for. If you're not a queen breeder, if you're instead a beekeeper who's trying to minimize the chemical inputs to their hive, then maybe you're saying, well, I really like HopGuard, or I really like oxalic acid treatments. But we know that those treatments aren't terribly effective at killing most of your mites if you've got brood in the colony. So I can cage my queen during a period of time where I don't really want the colony to grow. Middle of the summer, some colonies will be just growing as fast as they can, as far as they can. If you fed them, they'd just keep growing. Well, some people want to say, hey, look, there's no nectar for you for a while. There's not going to be any blooms until maybe the fall. So I can go in, I can cage my queen, and now I've suppressed that growth, so I'm just going to be holding that population for a while. And while that queen is caged, she's only laying eggs on one frame. There's plenty of brood, there's brood pheromone, they're not thinking the queen is dead or dying, so they're going to be able to take care of her, but she's limited in what she can lay. And then on the day that I want to do my formic acid my oxalic acid treatment or my Hopguard treatment, I can take that frame and get rid of it.
Right.
Or I can take that frame and just accept that some of those mites that are in those cells will still be safe, but they're, I've got the majority of the mites are not able to get into those cells. And so they're going to be killed by the treatment. I could also put a drone frame in here. And then that's going to mean that I can sort of do a 1-2 punch against the varroa mites. The queen's going to lay nothing but drone eggs. The mites are going to pour preferentially into those drone cells. I can take those out and feed them to my chickens, and then I can do my oxalic acid treatment, and now I've knocked down my mite population hugely just by using this sort of mechanical device in conjunction with my chemical management.
Right. And that's very beneficial for those of you who are trying to control. There are a lot of people that want to keep just a couple of hives.
Right.
And they don't want to expand. So this kind of is killing two birds with one stone, one cage here, because you'll create that brood break in a time of year when they normally wouldn't have one, unless you're somewhere where there's a remarkable dearth. And then that oxalic acid treatment has the highest efficacy. And so you've slowed them down and cut down on your numbers and probably reduced, because we have late season swarms here, because where I live, no dearth. So
right, they just
my
get that
problem
cue
is too many bees.
Growth.
So yeah, so it's great, and I'm glad that you're selling that.
Yes. And I'm sorry that you didn't know that.
And I'm
we were
also
selling it in time.
I want to thank Better Bee for sending me one of the first batch of their new cages in opposite land, because I didn't get one. So
unfortunately, we actually only have
because
one
I
in the
wanted
office.
one really bad.
I suggested
Okay.
that we bring it, and they said no, that's our only one. We've
Oh,
gotta
you
have
were
a
going to bring it?
Yeah, I was thought about it.
Okay, let's now. I know that tomorrow you're going to be talking about Varroa and maybe Nosema and some other things. I do have a question about the Varroa mite. First of all, how do they even know when they're going into a drone cell? We know that they prefer drones.
Yeah.
But how does the mite know the difference between a drone and a worker larvae?
So it's the same way that a honeybee does. It's by smell, right? So a varroa mite, a honeybee inside the colony is navigating by touch and by smell, because she can't see anything inside a dark hive.
Okay, so I had to cut out because I had a slight coughing fit. All right, we're back on track. So we're talking about how does the varroa know that it's going into a worker cell or a drone cell? The pheromones, you say.
Right. It's going to be primarily by odor. And we know that because if you look closely at a behaving varroa mite like that, you will notice that it's got its 8 legs. It's an arachnid, not an insect. But really, 6 of those legs are primarily for walking around. 2 of those legs, the 2 front legs, are used partially for locomotion, but partially also for detecting chemicals in their environment. So they've got these chemosensory hairs that come out of their front legs, and if you watch a varroa mite, if you take a varroa mite and you set it down on a table, or if you set it down on a flower...
Can we back up?
Yeah.
Chemosensory hairs. So chemo.
Hairs that sense chemicals.
Okay.
Chemosensory
And these
hairs.
are throughout their body?
They've got them all over their body, but we know most specifically and particularly that they're concentrated on those 2 front legs.
So they can smell through their hairs.
Just like a honeybee smells with its antennae,
Okay.
these mites are going to be smelling through those hairs that they're waving around.
Okay, not at all troubling.
So if you take a varroa mite and you put her on a flower and you watch her behavior, and that's something I've done, what you'll see is that the mites will actually walk right up to the edge of that flower petal, and then they'll stick just those 2 front legs up, and they'll just sort of wave them around. They just sort of move them in the air so that they can smell any scents and odors that might be wafting past them. And so that behavior is what we call questing. And it's the same thing that a tick does, also an arachnid that, sucks blood. But a tick is going to do that same thing out on a leaf or a branch or a piece of grass. It's just going to stick its legs out there and sniff the air, trying to figure out what might be moving past it. So a varroa mite is going to do that if it's away from a bee and away from a hive to try to get back, presumably. But inside a hive, as they're walking around, those chemosensory hairs are going to allow them to say, yep, this smells like a drone, or nope, that smells more like a worker. And that's critical. That's absolutely critical for the survival of the mites. Because for all of the time that they have lived exclusively on the eastern honeybee, the Asian honeybee Apis cerana, the original host of varroa mites, they had to only get into the drone cells. Because if they get into a worker cell, they can't
wasn't a long
reproduce,
enough
or they'll
incubation
even be
period.
detected and pulled out.
Okay.
So they can't go in, they can't have offspring, it just doesn't work for them. So they have to be very good at smelling the difference between a drone honeybee and a worker honeybee. And so that's something they've retained, even though they've gained the ability to go and reproduce on worker brood. They'll tolerate both in our bees, but they prefer the drones.
Okay. Now, once they emerge, the drone hatches, and once he's come out, do they immediately go into another one, or is there a certain amount of time they need to be out and about before re-entering another cell?
It's hard to study the behavior of an individual mite because they're riding around on the bees. They will move from bee to bee. They don't just feed on the bee that they crawled out of that cell on. They're going to be jumping onto typically nurse bees. We know that they will feed on nurse bees. We know that we find them feeding on nurse bees after they've sort of gone through that reproductive bout and emerged on the new young bee that's crawled out. So we know that happens. We've also seen varroa mites that come out and seem to very quickly wind up back and reproducing again. So it's not abundantly clear to us yet whether they have to be feeding separately for a while, or if they have a certain amount of protein they need in their body before they're ready to reproduce, and if they don't expend that the first time, maybe they can expend it again.
Oh yeah, that makes sense
But
too.
typically, we expect that they're going to go through at least some period where they're recovering from that reproductive effort, or really getting ready to go and reproduce their first time while they're feeding on nurse bees, feeding on their
Oh, I
fat
know what I
bodies.
wanted to say. So here's the cell.
Yep.
Here's the varroa going in just before it gets capped. They actually go under the pupa.
Right.
Is that right?
Right. They tend to
Now
go into
there's
the food.
a bunch of fluid in there. Do they have some kind of appendage that lets them breathe? Is there something that sticks up above the fluid?
Oh, then now that's interesting. They don't suffocate while they're in there, but
Right.
it's relatively hard to suffocate an insect or an arthropod or a mite like this. So I don't know if they've got a snorkel per se that they're sticking up that allows them to breathe, or if there's enough oxygen diffusion from within the hive through the cell, through the food, and then into the mite's body that they don't suffer for it. Very soon afterwards, of course, that food is going to be
Consumed,
eaten by the larva. So the mite's really just playing a quick waiting game until it's just them and that bee locked away in that cell together.
And you mentioned a tick. We know that a tick can be out on a blade of grass or brush or whatever for an extended period of time. What's the life expectancy of an adult?
Also hard. So we know that varroa mites that are actively reproducing are going to sort of burn through their calories and burn through their nutrition, and then will make some misstep and get knocked off by the bees, or will just die. We also know, of course, that varroa mites that are on our bees in September, October, when the brood rearing stops, are there ready to jump in when the brood rearing picks up again. And so we know that varroa mites can live multiple months just riding around on the bees.
Provided they
waiting,
can feed on a bee.
as long as they can feed on a bee.
What about with no host?
The longest I've ever kept one alive was 9 days.
9 days,
I think the longest that's been published in the literature is 6 or 7 days. But 9 days was the longest I was able to get one varroa mite to live, and that was in a laboratory, controlled climate, no sun beating down on her, and she was in an aquarium that basically had controlled humidity. So she was in a nice, humid, relatively warm environment, just sitting there, and was alive for 9 days.
Okay. So anything else going on at Better Bee that people should know about? Anything new?
All kinds
know
of cool
that
stuff.
You teach classes in person there?
Yep. We
And
have
you
both
online as well?
online and in-person classes, and the in-person classes, we're just getting ready to schedule our first big batch of them. I have actually not been able to teach many in-person classes at Better Bee because I joined during the pandemic when we couldn't safely have folks come in and study with us. But we've got those in-person classes, the online classes on various subjects, and if you have something that you want there to be a class on and nobody's offering it, you can feel free to write to us, and maybe I'll create a lecture and we can create a class for you. But we've also got a lot of other great educational materials that are coming out. We're working with the Chester County Beekeeping Association in southeast PA as opposed to northwest PA. And we've worked with them to create this educational passport as really a tool for clubs like theirs to drive engagement, to make sure folks are visiting their bees, trying to get a full beekeeping experience, managing mites, keeping on top of their various hive inspections. And so we're working with them and prototyping that, testing that out. We're hoping we can launch that more broadly for other clubs to use as kind of a tool to help drive engagement and keep folks on task, keeping their bees healthy. And so, yeah, we've got, our monthly newsletter. We've always got material coming out. We have a YouTube channel ourselves that I would encourage folks to subscribe to.
We'll put a link in the video description to the YouTube channel.
There you go. Sounds like a plan. So, our goal is not to be like the questionable beekeeping suppliers or the questionable nuke or package suppliers that say, here are your bees, give us the money, now get out of here. We want to provide support. We want people to succeed. My goal as a beekeeper or as someone who works at a company that sells bees is really to be able to sell you bees once. I sell you one package, and then you come back to me for the next 40 years, and you're buying new hives every year and new equipment and new tools because your bees did so well that you split them, and now you've got 2 hives, and now you've got 4 hives, and now you've got 8 hives, and you're having a wonderful time with those bees that I initially sold you. It's not, it's not comforting to me if you come to me every year and say, I'm going to buy the same 2 packages I always buy because they never survive. So I want to try to make sure that doesn't happen. If I ran an animal shelter and you came to me and kept getting a new kitten every 6 months, I would start to have questions about what you're doing to these kittens, and I might not want to give them to you. We like our bees. We take care of them. So we want to make sure you're doing that too, and I think that most folks want to do right by these animals. But as you've demonstrated, in great abundance, there's a lot to talk about in bees. There's a lot to know about in bees. There's a lot that we still don't understand about bees. And so it's critical that you go in knowing that you know what you need to learn more, and you're always going to need to learn more. And so, at Better Bee, we try to be a company that prioritizes that education and make sure that we're giving folks bees, but we're giving them exactly what they need to succeed with them as well.
So now, you came from Cornell University. And there were a lot of places you could have gone to look for work. Why did you pick Better Bee of all the other opportunities?
So, I could have gone the academic route. I could have looked for a postdoctoral fellowship or a professorship after my postdoctoral position at Cornell. I wasn't sure that I wanted to go into academia. I appreciate a lot of the great bee research that happens either in universities or at USDA facilities or other sort of groups like that conduct this bee research. But I think that sometimes those groups can get detached from the beekeepers and the questions that they have about their bees. And so it seems like some professors get so excited about their very, very focused biological question that they almost forget that there are beekeepers that might benefit from anything that they're doing. They're just so focused on learning about the genetics or learning about the metabolism of the insect that they're studying that they're not really asking and answering beekeeping questions. And so I felt like maybe going to a place like Better Bee would allow me to do some of that research and also would give me plenty of opportunity to teach. And instead of teaching a bunch of, students who think, what could I ever possibly have to know about a honeybee? I'm just a cool college kid. It's a lot nicer to have folks coming into me and saying, I want bees or I've got bees and I want to know more about them. So there's nothing better than a motivated student. That as an educator. And so that was a really nice opportunity for me. Better Bee is a great environment. It's a company that prioritizes giving me the freedom that I need as a researcher to ask interesting biological questions, or as a teacher to say, I think we should teach a class on this. It doesn't sell products. It's not about, the next great thing that they should buy. It's just a thing that I think beekeepers ought to know. And they're thrilled to have me do it. So I'm thrilled to be there.
So anything new coming along product-wise? We talked about the cage.
Well, we just had a meeting today, and I think we've firmed up our plans to carry a new hive scale called the Hivetronics scale. It's manufactured in Nova Scotia. It was designed and developed by a group of they're actually marine engineers, and so as you very well know, you got to be a pretty good engineer to take a bunch of stainless steel and throw it in the ocean and have it survive. And so, they've built this thing to be as rugged and as durable as they possibly can. It really impressed us when we were given one to try out. And so we've decided that we're going to be carrying that in the U.S. I'm not sure exactly when that's going to be available. It's not on the website. We're just getting this organized. But
Interesting.
it's a very exciting scale that perhaps some tech evaluating early adopters might be interested in purchasing and trying out.
You know it. Just take my money. So anyway, so for example, there aren't a lot of choices in B scales out there right now. A lot of people have used, I know you probably can't say this, but I can, Broodminder. A lot of my friends use Broodminder, and even university studies have spent the big bucks and got a bunch of them, the scale specifically, and it's proven to be very inconsistent for a lot of the people that report it. I never bought one. So, so what would be different about the scale that you're talking about as compared to that? You read it on your phone, and it kind of had some wonky balance issues and stuff.
So the Broodminder scale does what it does. And what it does is you attach it to a particular hive, and then you know how much that hive weighs. So if you're a local bee club and you've got a hive and you're going to blast all of its information out on Facebook so that everybody can follow your little mascot hive, it's marvelous. It's fantastic.
Okay.
If you're a scientific researcher and you've got the time to get
Have you used the Broodminder?
I have, yeah.
Oh, you
Better
do?
Bee carries
Okay.
it as well.
Oh, I didn't know.
But it's it's good for what it's good for.
Okay.
What this scale does is something very much different. So the Broodminder is a scale that I'm going to put onto a hive that I want to focus on. This is a scale that has a cam system that I can slide it underneath any hive in my apiary as long as I've got it up on 2x4s. I can crank this handle down, and it's going to lift that whole hive up. It's going to give me a direct readout onto my phone and say, oh, that's how much it is, and I can write it down or,
you're kidding.
or save it in the app. I can pull that out, and I can go right to the next one and weigh it. So it lets me go through my entire apiary, whether that's 3 hives or 300 hives in the fall, and say, how much do you weigh? How much do I want you to weigh? I've hefted hives plenty of times in my beekeeping career. And what I often find is I'm pretty good at estimating how much a hive weighs for the first 3 of them. And then my arm gets tired. And by the last one, I'm going, oh, this one's heavy or light, or I'm not sure. I'll feed him a little bit and then wish him the best. So this solves that problem. It lets you get a really, really clear, very rapid, accurate measurement of...
And you can move it hive to hive, where like the Broodminder, you set it under the hive, it stays
You're
there.
carrying this around the apiary, and then you're bringing it home and storing it in your garage.
No kidding. Is it stainless steel?
The panel that actually lifts is stainless, and I think the panel underneath it is. So it's, it's a really, really beautifully made
I know it's
device.
probably premature, but what's the price point? What do you think?
Oh, it's gonna be more than 200 and less than 1,000. No, I think it's I think it's gonna be pretty manageable. It's probably not something that a budget conscious hobbyist who has 2 hives is gonna be really eager to jump on top of. But it's the kind of thing that I think a club would really benefit from buying.
Sure.
Right? Just like clubs that buy extractors and then let their members borrow or use them. This is a fantastic resource to say, all right, well, you take it on Monday and you take it on Tuesday. Everybody weigh your hives, and then we're going to figure out who's underweight, who's overweight, and we're going to make recommendations on who should be feeding who.
So that's the other thing, too, is what's the value of knowing the weight? Is it to compare the weight of other colonies in the same apiary, or is it use it as kind of a...
Well, as a scientist,
indicator,
you or I might be very interested to learn that one of our hives weighs twice as much as the other. Realistically, for most beekeepers, the benefit is, I think, going to be, I know that in order to have my bees survive in this climate, in this area, I need them to weigh 120 pounds before the winter. And so if I go out and I find a 110-pound hive or an 80-pound hive with this, it lets me know that I have to feed them, and it gives me an estimate of how much I have to feed them. So it's going to, I think, it's the kind of thing that's going to cost a few $100s, but it's going to more than pay for itself if it starts saving 2, 3, 4, 5 of your colonies from dying over the winter because you were underestimating how much feeding you needed to do.
So going into winter, you mentioned 2 to 1 is one of your great methods. What's another way to get a colony to, it's an emergency, it's the end of the year, we need them to gain weight fast. What's your best super weight gain practice for beehive colonies?
I think realistically the best that I would offer to my first strategy, my first goal, as long as it's not so cold that I can't safely put in the 2 to 1 syrup, because there is still extra moisture, they do still need to relieve themselves, so I don't want to be feeding that all through the winter. I'll start with that. That's my first strategy. My next strategy, if I want to make a colony gain 20 pounds of sugar, I can always just put a shim on a sheet of newspaper and then put 20 pounds of sugar on top of them. So,
Which is called the mountain camp method.
right. So using dry sugar, using candy board, using fondant, using winter patties, ultimately all of these are the same thing. It's sugar that I've piled on top of my colony that has some or no water added to it and mixed up into it. But whatever substance that you created there is just going to give the bees something that they can lick and get calories out of.
Okay.
I'd always rather have them have liquid syrup stored in frames as if it was honey or honey, because that's what they're used to, that's what they're naturally inclined towards, and their behavior matches it. But if I need my cluster to move up to the top and then lick a whole bunch of sugar, I can guarantee that hive will gain 20 pounds in 3 seconds if I sit there with my bag and I dump 20 pounds of sugar on them.
Right, yeah.
It might not be received and accepted quite as efficiently as some others, but it's a good way to add some weight.
Now, Better Bee has an apiary?
Better Bee has many apiaries.
Okay, so how many colonies are we talking about under Better Bee's control?
Gosh, now our head beekeeper Anne is going to be very upset because I'm not going to have the exact number. I believe that at the end of the winter we had north of 700 colonies.
Okay.
Many of those, in fact, most of those, I think, are overwintered nucleus colonies that we sell.
Okay.
So those are bees that have those northern queens that we breed. Those are our bees that we've been taking care of, and then we'll sell those on to customers to take home. And then the rest of the colonies are producing honey, but they're also being broken down or splits taken out of them to produce the next overwintered nukes.
How did this past winter go? Do you know?
Remarkably well.
So percentage-wise, survivability?
I've only talked to Anne about some of the yards, and I can tell you that early in the spring, or mid-spring, I guess, before any additional deaths had happened, she was coming in saying some of the yards were having 95% survival. We had remarkably good. I think some of them might have been 80, but I don't know that she had any that were 70%. And in other years, sometimes you only have 20, 30, 40% survival in a really bad year.
Do you guys participate in the Bee Informed Partnership? Do you?
Yep. Yeah.
Well,
we collect
survivability.
We carefully collect all of our data on survivability. The issue is that being overwintered nukes. Sometimes, if all of the colonies over here survive, but they survived under our sort of weird business practices because we're selling on those nukes. Saying those colonies survived the winter isn't quite the same as comparing it to your honey production hives in your backyard. So we report what we think is appropriate to report for the hives that sort of match the criteria.
And for those that are watching, if you're in the United States, it's really valuable. We're coming to the end of the Bee Informed Partnership's annual survey. So if you would please Google the Bee Informed Partnership and go ahead and report if you currently keep bees, no matter what your level is, 1 colony or 1,000, because it helps us all get a big picture of survival. And there are specific questions about how you manage your bees, and it helps us develop best practices for beekeeping.
Right. And it's so important as a beekeeper to know if I had 50% of my bees die over the winter. If I can compare them to everyone in the U.S. and everyone else only had 30% survive, then I'm doing pretty well. If everyone else had 95% survive and I lost half of my colonies, clearly I need to adjust my behaviors.
Right.
So by building that data set, it makes it very easy to make reasonable comparisons and say, all right, everybody in my state did better than me or worse than me, so that means that I either should keep my mouth shut at my next bee meeting or I should be the one giving the lecture.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and state by state, sometimes it doesn't look very good. I think the state of Pennsylvania right now is at 40% losses. So that wasn't my individual experience, but some of our biggest beekeepers lost 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10. So it's a big deal. So one of the advantages, if you don't keep bees yet, you should still look at the Bee Informed Partnership and look at best bee practices or beekeeping practices so that you can kind of understand what's working in the area where you live. And that's really important. So there's a lot of good information that can be gleaned there. It's a citizen science feedback system. It's been going for 10 years. And they're doing great work. So just our feedback is valuable to other beekeepers going forward. We identify trends and everything else. So in New York, where you are, what's the optimum hive configuration? And I realize a lot of this is very independent, depending on what somebody wants out of the bees, why they're keeping the
Right.
bees, and how they're going to manage the bees, and whether they can lift boxes,
Right.
8 frames, 10 frames, but just generally, what's your winter configuration look like?
I think we're still learning. I think all beekeeping is still trying to learn what the best options are and what better or worse options are. And there are differences even between myself and Better Bee's head beekeeper and the way that she keeps the colonies that are sort of part of the company's property, and then her own bees. I think there are even little tweaks and modifications that she might do a little differently here or there. So I think beekeepers have a lot of flexibility. And it's important to remember, if I tell you that I use upper entrances, I have, venting at the top of my hives over winter, and you
Do
tell
you?
me that you don't. I do.
Okay.
I
And
don't
this
know
is a
that
good
that's
example,
better,
by the way.
but I
You
do
can
it.
get along with people that
Even when
keep
they're wrong.
bees differently from one another.
But my point is this. I've got colonies that have top entrances, and they've survived. You've got colonies that don't have top entrances, and they've survived.
Right.
So clearly, it's not a make or break thing. It's not absolutely critical to do it or not do it.
Correct.
We can do some math and we can do some statistics, and we can figure out that maybe you've got 10% better survival or 10% worse survival than mine, and then we might learn something. But it's important to keep in mind that there are no absolute hard and fast, if you do this, all of your bees are going to die. You should only do it my way because only my way will lead to success.
Right.
I overwinter in, right now I've been overwintering in 2 deeps with no extra honey on top, and I don't give them fondant or a candy board or anything. I do a midwinter inspection when I have a decent day, and if I find that they're too high, then I would add supplemental feed to them. I have an upper entrance. I don't use a quilt box, and I have done all of these things. I have, opened or closed those entrances. I have used moisture control or not. And I've had colonies that have lived and died in each configuration.
Right.
But that's what I'm currently doing, and I don't necessarily say that that's what everyone else should do. I know a lot about varroa mites. I know a fair amount about honeybee behavior. I don't necessarily know the optimal overwinter strategy for my particular region. It might be different in your region. So you've just got to recognize that a lot of things can succeed. Just because something's worked doesn't mean you couldn't do better. And just because something failed doesn't mean that it's doomed to failure for everyone all the time.
What's your opinion, and as a wild card, what's your opinion about the Darwinian beekeeping practice that Dr. Seeley's talking about?
So I've had a lot of conversations with Dr. Seeley about this, and I think that you need to be careful when you explain an idea like Darwinian beekeeping, because it can sometimes it's if you don't present it in a way that everyone will immediately clearly understand, there's risk of confusion. And I think some people have heard what Tom has been talking about and gotten confused by what his message was. So what he's been espousing has been this idea that if we allow our bees to live in a more natural lifestyle, and if we allow the weakest of our bees that have varroa mites to die, and then the strongest of the bees that are able to control those varroa mites to some extent to survive and breed, that we will wind up with a healthier bee population overall. But by killing the weakest genes and then keeping the strongest ones, we're going to have healthier bees. And that's true. I mean, that's how biological evolution works.
And I would like to make a point while we're talking about that. Dr. Seeley doesn't just suggest that they die, but that you actually euthanize a failing colony before it.
That's really the heart of it. And that was something that he and I had a number of conversations about, and that he's tried to incorporate into those presentations, but somehow people keep missing, is that he's saying if you've got a colony that has high mite levels, he's not saying be a hands-off beekeeper who doesn't manage mites at all, doesn't think about mites, and just wishes their bees luck. He's saying find those weak colonies that have those bad genes and kill them before those mite levels, before those mites reproduce so dramatically that they're then going to be, picked up by other bees or carried by other bees into your healthy colonies. Because you can kill a whole apiary just from one colony that's breeding those mites, and then they'll spread them and the viruses. So what he's recommending is that you either isolate those colonies and leave them off to die far away from all other bees, or more realistically, euthanize them, kill those bees so that they and their mites aren't spreading mites, but they also aren't spreading their genes into the next generation of bees. So it's not something that is a particularly good strategy for me, the beekeeper with 2 hives.
Right.
It's not really advice that's intended for me, the beekeeper with 2 hives, or you, the beekeeper with 2 hives. It's a strategy that you could use if you were an entire population of beekeepers, an entire island, an entire county, an entire association of beekeepers who wanted to embark on trying to breed a more resistant bee.
Oh yeah, like that Newfoundland study.
Well, Newfoundland doesn't have varroa mites.
Oh,
So not that.
skip that. Ignore me.
But it's a strategy that over a large area, over a large population of bees, you might be able to develop a breeding program that's sort of inspired by some of these principles.
Okay.
But for me, the backyard beekeeper with my neighbor keeping bees and then my other neighbor keeping bees, all I'm going to be doing is breeding mite bombs or having to go kill all of my colonies because it turns out none of them have those magical mite resistance genes we're looking for. Because most colonies aren't, entirely mite resistant.
Right, and Dr. Seeley's working with the Arnott Forest line.
Right, and so all of the work that Tom and I have done with those Arnott Forest bees and their resistance traits has basically shown us that the Arnott Forest bees have mite resistance traits. They have various mite resistance traits. They groom more than most bees do. They are more hygienic than most bees. They uncap and recap. They've got all of these traits. But they don't have them at the absolute highest levels that we've ever been able to breed into a bee. And they also, if I took an Arnott Forest colony, and I did this for my dissertation, if I take an Arnott Forest colony and I put them in a 10-frame Langstroth hive, and I don't let them swarm, and I just give them more and more and more hive bodies to grow into, and they just grow and grow and grow over the course of the season, some of them are going to collapse because of varroa mites. The mites are there, and the mites reproduce.
Because the mites are growing with the bees, yeah.
So you've got these bees that have resistance traits that have emerged probably because they've been naturally selected, but they're not a mite-proof bee. And so it's a combination of the lifestyle of living in the forest. It's a combination of the management that you, a beekeeper, provide to them that might simulate that forest lifestyle, and their behaviors and their mite resistance traits that help them out and that might make them an interesting bee. I do like to say when we talk about the Arnott Forest bees, the survivor bee population that have never been treated because they've been living in trees for the last umpteen years, they aren't magical bees. The bees that are living in that forest we talk about because Tom went and studied them in the 1970s before Varroa arrived.
And they did go through a profound decline.
They did. Right? A lot of bees died. Or the genetic evidence tells us that a lot of those colonies died, and then the survivors repopulated the forest. But the important thing is we know that because we had these old samples, and then we could take some new samples. But there are a lot of forests that have a lot of bees in them. And some of those bees are escaped from, the commercial beekeeper who has an apiary right next door.
Right.
But some of those bees might have been out in those forests for years. And so if you catch a swarm, don't just bring them in and immediately dequeen and requeen them like some people tell you to do. Be mindful that swarms from forests or state parks
wait
can
to
have
see
disease.
what their performance is.
But check them out. See how they do.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because a lot of people are under that impression. If you catch a feral swarm,
Right. Oh, they're going to be mean.
I'm going to remove the
be
queen, I'm going to
unproductive.
requeen them, I'm going to control the genetics. Wait to see, you might have the most awesome queen you've ever had in your life.
Absolutely.
Because you don't know what you're going to have. You hive that swarm, when are you going to know what you have? 30 days out.
So I've always made sure I've got a bait hive, in the deepest, darkest part of whatever state forest or wildlife management area I can find that's as far away from known beekeepers as possible.
Yeah.
Because if I catch a swarm there, they could be a very interesting swarm.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of when you get a swarm, number one, I don't bring it into my bee yard. Like if it's a swarm that I get from a swarm call,
Quarantine.
I'm on the list. It's just like if you had aquariums and tropical fish. You have your hospital tank over there and it's in quarantine until you know they're okay. Same thing, I started satellite bee yards. And that's where my swarms go. And then if they do well, then I'll bring them back. But they're not going straight into my primary apiary. So that's good to know. There's another thing I want to ask you about, and you may not know about it at all, but I get questions from viewers. The Russian scythe or something, it's for attracting swarms. They use a piece of wood and a wooden barrier over the top, and then they dip it in beeswax, and supposedly you can mount that near your apiary, and when your bees go to their intermediate bivouac, they'll go to that, and then it's in a right at arm's length collection.
It's not really so much a swarm attractant like a bait hive. It's essentially just like a really attractive bivouac site.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not a bait hive.
Right.
It's the intermediate, instead of them pausing 30 feet up that tree, which happens to me all the time.
Right.
They will go to this, and you can position it at eye level or 8 feet or something Have you ever tried it, or you know anything about
Well, I've
it?
not used that, but I will tell you that my favorite bee yards and my most successful to manage bee yards are the bee yards where the only trees nearby are the dwarf fruit trees, right? It's the dwarf apple trees all around them, which means they're only going to get 10 feet tall, which means
Okay.
that's the tallest thing that a swarm can move on to. If you set up an apiary right next to 80-foot tall trees, it's entirely possible that the swarm will go 40, 50, 60, 70,
Yeah.
80 feet up. And those are the swarms that I look at and go, whoa, oh, I wish I had a ladder truck, but I don't.
guess
So bye.
Guess they're gone.
That's not a swarm for me. So, having anything on ground level that's going to be attractive to them, anything that's sort of an obvious settling location,
Yeah.
might catch that swarm. They might start accumulating on it. The queen might land on it, and if it works,
I
then
just had another
makes
thought.
it easier.
Instead of hanging that thing. Because I do notice once the initial swarm goes out in spring, which, by the way, for those who are watching northeastern United States, the end of this month, you could have a swarm. So be ready. They're going to catch you off guard. Not me, but you.
Right.
They'll catch you off guard.
If the sun is shining, it could be swarm season. Swarm season is all the time, but particular swarm season is
Once the initial swarm collects on a
Coming up.
certain branch, usually on a maple tree or something, subsequent swarms, so a week down the road, 2 weeks, they always tend to go to the same. Is there a residual pheromone or something on that branch that has to attract them? Why do they? They're not from the same colony.
Well, it could be that every remember, when a swarm leaves your apiary, when they
Yeah.
leave the hive,
Yeah.
they form this enormous cloud. So
Sure.
you've really got this amorphous cloud of bees that's twice the size of the apiary.
Yeah. So
if there's only one site that sort of meets their instinct, that provides all of the right sort of sheltered and shaded and over here and on the good branch, so maybe
Yeah.
they're just always going to follow the same cues. But I wouldn't be at all surprised to learn that some of the Nasonov pheromone and the other contact pheromones are building
Maybe
up.
I could hang a little canvas bag of propolis and beeswax.
If you can get them started on it, then
Use it
maybe
as a
they'll just keep coming
magnet.
back.
That's interesting.
Or you could just suppress swarming in your colonies, and then you won't have to deal with that.
Okay. All right. Well, those are all good things. What? Oh, I noticed something that was in your catalog, by the way. This is not just a big advertisement for Better Bee. I'm just getting my questions answered. But I've been using a professional butterfly net to go up and shake bees into it. And I was looking, I think it's Better Bee. It better be. You had a pole with a canvas swarm collection bag. Is that you guys?
Well, I don't know that I've ever seen one, but I
think
haven't
it's a-
seen
I think
every
it's a-
product.
I think it's a Better
Do
Bee.
you have our catalog?
No,
I don't
why would
know of it.
Why would I have a Better Bee catalog?
So
Everything's online. So no, but it's on a pole, and it looks like an unbleached muslin bag, and it's got a flip, like you pull the top back.
we might carry it, but I've never seen one. I've
Okay.
used pole buckets. I've used
Yeah, I don't
drywall
like
buckets
those.
on
I don't
poles.
like the
They're
buckets.
finicky, but they can work.
You know why I like the canvas bags? They're breathable all over. The bees can get their footing on them. And when I shake them out and I just set them out in front of the hive, they just march in right out of the bag. So the buckets I find those a little bit unwieldy, because the other thing is you can slide a canvas bag in under your bees along a branch and things like that.
Right. The flexibility. Could
Which,
be
by
a
the
big
way, this is
advantage.
another plug. Sorry to do it. Colorado Bee Vac is my favorite. If there's an outlet somewhere, that's what I'm using to get swarms now. I know they're expensive. For those of you, that's fine. Butterfly nets work. If that canvas thing is there, I'm going to put a link in the description. Pretty sure I saw it on your website.
If we have it, you should buy it from us, and if
Oh.
someone else has it, you should buy it from them, because it sounds like it'd be
Okay.
neat to use.
It's a canvas bag, goes on the end of a pole.
Or
Well,
you can make your own.
I'm really glad that we had this time to talk with Dr. Peck tonight. I'm glad that he stopped in. He's going to be talking tomorrow, which you won't see this in time for, Edinburgh. What's the name of the hall?
I don't remember. I wrote it down.
Anyway, Edinburgh University, Northwest Pennsylvania Beekeepers Association. If this goes live, no, it's 9:30 now, so it won't be live tonight. But thank you for being here, and thanks for talking and sharing, and I'm looking forward to your lecture series tomorrow.
Sure.
And I hope you enjoyed this video, and Dr. Peck, first person other than me ever to talk from this YouTube studio. Thanks for being here. Have a fantastic rest of your weekend.